What goes around comes around. There's discrimination here. We don't get a bottle of hand sanitizer. We've got a bottle of hand sanitizer. I'm going to write a letter. Maureen, I took your seat for a moment and they evicted me.
Yeah, well, I was heading for yours until I realised I should be coming over here.
Well, I got a letter and was told, well, look at this. I was getting discriminated against. Hand sanitizer. Devastating.
Recovering. I'd have to get COVID long before I was due back here.
Yes, we did note that. We thought about that.
I read all the fine print, you'll be very pleased with me. I read the presiding officer's fine print, every bit of it, and discovered that, because I relied on the rat test on the Saturday night, which was negative, but I was still unwell, and I read it and I thought, oh, they won't let me in the building if I'm not well, so I better do PCR, which was, otherwise I'd have probably flown up here,
Well, good on you for not.
spread some cheer,
Well, it hopefully gave you a chance.
but that's fine. I just getting there. I've lost my sense of smell and taste.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's still missing. I don't know how long, we'll see.
It's a common symptom.
Yeah, it is, and the breathlessness bothers me more than anything. But lots of walking in this place, so
Honourable members, the Deputy Speaker.
Are there any constituency statements by honourable members? And I call the member for Clark.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, on Saturday I attended the Hobartians Facing Homelessness rally, where again I was outraged to hear stories from people about the great difficulties they face sleeping rough or finding and keeping a safe and affordable roof over their heads. And this dire situation is getting worse, Deputy Speaker, as evidenced by Tasmania's social housing wait list doubling over the last 8 years, with 4,453 applicants now queued up and priority applicants waiting an average 67 weeks to be accommodated. But of course, averages don't tell the whole story, and I can think of the particular family who've been on the priority waiting list for almost 7 years, despite living currently in a private rental plagued with black mould, holes in the ceiling and cracked windows. To make matters worse, private rentals are no longer an option for many, as they are so scarce and unaffordable, with Hobart's vacancy rate sitting currently at 0.6%. And for many of the lucky home hunters who are successful and do secure a property, the rent is so high that they face the very real decision of whether to forego medical appointments, heating, fuel or even food to afford the rent. Indeed, the Rental Affordability Index continues to rate Greater Hobart as the country's least affordable metropolitan area, with the median rent having increased by 50% since 2016. And with interest rates rising, we can expect rents to increase further as rises are handballed onto tenants. Deputy Speaker, the situation really is grim, and we need a hell of a lot more than band-aid solutions if we are to turn things around. For instance, at the local government level, we need to free up land, facilitate sensible developments and applications more efficiently, and rein in the conversion of long-term rentals to short-stay holiday accommodation. At the state level, we need more crisis accommodation, more social housing, more supported accommodation for people with special needs, and rent-to-buy public housing. And of course, at the federal level, we need an extension of the National Rental Affordability Scheme, an increase in Commonwealth rent assistance, and deep investment property tax reform. On a positive note, though, good on Hobart City Council, which just last night decided to investigate higher rates for homes used as short-stay accommodation. This is a smart move, especially seeing as Hobart now has proportionally 7 times more Airbnbs than Sydney, which is patently unsustainable and unacceptable when locals are being forced into the cold. Deputy Speaker, the housing crisis is the result of years of flawed policy making at all levels of government. But it can be remedied and sure needs to be, because access to safe, secure and affordable housing is a fundamental human right.
Member for his wonderful contribution, and I give the call to the Manager of Government Business. Take a breath.
Thanks very much, Deputy Speaker. He's not one you can stop. We've worked that out.
I was trying to be polite.
Deputy Speaker, I rise to talk about the Cooks River in my part of Sydney, running through the Canterbury Bankstown area, but adjacent local councils as well. The Cooks River has been for some time the most polluted river in Australia. And while people will often talk about rivers and put forward photographs of beautiful rivers in regional areas, it's important to remember that people who live in lower income areas, that shouldn't determine whether or not they get natural beauty. It shouldn't be the case. We all accept that people with more money will be able to spend more money on their home. But the right to decent, clean public space is something that should be available no matter where you live. In my part of Sydney, the remediation of the Cooks River has been a long-term project for many, and certainly something locally that I've dedicated a good part of my career to. Effectively, what happened generations ago was the idea was to initially partly as flooding mitigation, but the theory was just get the water moving as quickly as possible. And that meant that every natural bank was replaced with concrete. It meant every natural stream became a stormwater drain. And we ended up with large parts of the Cooks River where, if you looked at it, you would not think you were looking at a river at all. You would simply say that now is a stormwater drain. When Labor was last in government, we started the remediation, and we did something really interesting at a place called Cup and Saucer Creek, where we intercepted the stormwater. So first of all, we put some gross pollutant traps to catch the rubbish, but then we took over a small park and put in some wetlands where the water from the stormwater drain would come in and feed the wetlands. The water would then seep through 3 different wetlands before it returned to the river. And lo and behold, going through a new natural system, the water that would return to the river was crystal clear, pure water. I'm pleased with the change of government and the Urban Rivers program, something that I'm expecting to be part of the October budget, that the Cooks River has a chance to again get federal government funding so that we can see a situation into the future where your postcode doesn't determine whether the river has natural banks or concrete, where people, and we all saw when you got half an hour or an hour of exercise time during the pandemic, lots of people didn't have anywhere particularly nice to go within 5 kilometres. I want to turn that around. It shouldn't be determined by your postcode.
I thank the member for his contribution and give the call to the honourable member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise and I'm pleased to talk about the fellas at Burleigh Community Men's Shed in Miami, and I joined them on the 7th of July, just last month, for morning tea. And as we know, Deputy Speaker, Men's Shed plays a really important role in mental health outcomes for our community, and I thank the fellas there at Burleigh Men's Shed. It was a great opportunity to meet with the members to see what they're working on and hear about the fantastic work that they do in our community, and you should see some of the woodwork. Mr Deputy Speaker, they gave me a beautiful little gift as I left, which sits a pride of place in my office there in Surfers Paradise. And the President, Rob Livett, talked about a marvellous partnership program that the Burleigh Men's Shed has with the Broadbeach State School, which is a beautiful school in my electorate. And the Deputy Principal there, Mr Jenks, Wayne Jenks, has been a driving force behind this particular partnership. So I take the opportunity to applaud Mr Jenks, as he's known by his student body, for thinking outside the box and always going that extra mile when it comes to his beautiful school there in Broadbeach. The program is still relatively new and it's been named Boys to Men, tentatively, and it's so far seen 2 successful rounds. And Boys to Men runs every term, and provides the opportunity for 6 to 8 young impressionable men or boys to visit the shed. And it's during those visits the boys are taught woodwork, and they're taught machinery safety, and they're taught, most importantly, certainly at Men's Shed, the value of mateship, which is so important. And the students form lovely relationships with the fellas there, who become, of course, their role models and mentors, which is so important. The shed provides a new and different way to learn and socialise in a setting outside the schoolyard, and allows for students to grow and thrive. And so, so far the outcomes and the feedback have been tremendously positive within the school community and at the shed. And I've told that there are others across the schoolyard at Broadbeach Primary, with an increasing number of students raising their hands to be considered for each new round of the Boys to Men program. And they, of course, want to go to Burleigh Men's Shed. And Rob has told me that girls also wish to get involved, so that's good news. So the program may need a bit of a name change from Boys to Men to be for all genders, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I greatly commend both the Burleigh Community Men's Shed and, of course, Broadbeach State School for launching this beneficial and positive program, Boys to Men. And I also want to take this chance to give the Secretary, Jim Caswell, Vice President Stuart Capper, Shed Coordinator Ray Deverson, and all of the fantastic members of Burleigh Men's Shed a shout-out for welcoming me there to their cup of tea on a Thursday afternoon, and I can't wait to come back and see you fellas soon.
I thank the member for Moncrieff, and I give the call to the honourable member for Perth.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm proud that I stood in front of my community asking for them to send me back to this place on a platform of bringing people together. And indeed, they endorsed that, and I'm so grateful to the people of Perth for endorsing that vision. A vision of bringing people together by acting on the Uluru Statement from the Heart, making sure that we finally get proper recognition of our first Australians in our Constitution, bringing people together when it comes to acting on climate change, making sure that we walk together towards that path to net zero by 2050, bringing people together when it comes to making sure that people can afford and access childcare for their children, making sure that they can access the jobs that they need to provide for their families, bringing people together by restoring faith and integrity in government through a proper anti-corruption commission, and bringing people together on the challenges that we know we have as a country post-COVID. Manufacturing, ensuring we have respect at work, making sure that we invest again in our TAFE and acting on the economic challenges in front of us, and bringing people together in some of the things I'm proud to have put to my community for their endorsement in the Perth electorate, one of which is the $50 million commitment to an Aboriginal cultural centre in the heart of the Perth electorate, making sure that we can tell the thousands, the millions of stories that have been on this land for more than 60,000 years. I think that this project could be the Sydney Opera House of the West Coast, something of which we can all be proud. Equally, bringing people together in terms of making sure that every Australian has access to the healthcare they need. And on that front, I'm proud of our commitment to a Medicare urgent care clinic in the heart of the Perth electorate in the CBD. Bringing people together in the places that we love to gather around our rivers, and indeed the Urban Rivers platform that we took for the Swan and Canning River is about making sure that we preserve these beautiful riverbanks for generations to come. Indeed, commitments to Barden Park to make sure that we continue to remove the weeds that have destroyed otherwise beautiful native bushland, commitment to restoring the Maylands Lakes, and a commitment to a National Trust site in Tranby House. Commitment to an oval that is well loved by the Perth community in Bassendean Oval, making sure that it has the lights that is needed for players to be able to play into the night. I had the joy of opening the change rooms with the former member for Hasluck for the women's change rooms at that site. That was only half the project. The other half of the project is making sure that those players can play late into the evening. Equally, I'm proud of the commitment we have. Bringing people together requires people getting to the jobs that they do, the places they need to be. That means investing in our bus infrastructure. And on that note, I'll finish by saying how proud I am of the commitment to electric bus manufacturing in Perth for the future.
I thank the honourable member for Perth and give the call to the member for Gippsland.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. When I refer to the previous government's decision to cut the fuel excise in half, it was a decision which saved motorists 22 cents per litre at a cost to the budget of some $2.9 billion over a 6 months period. Now, I acknowledge, Deputy Speaker, that was intended as a temporary and targeted measure in direct response to the war in Ukraine, in direct response to supply pressures and escalating prices for Australian motorists and small business owners. There was an understanding by the previous government that those circumstances, those conditions, were putting real pressure on households, real pressure on the small business community. Now, Deputy Speaker, those external conditions still exist today, and the new government should extend the excise cut until after the summer school holidays, until at least February 2023. Now, the reason I raise this today, Deputy Speaker, is here on this side of the House, in the Coalition, we tend to represent the communities with the lowest household incomes. Our communities, particularly in rural and regional areas, tend to have lower incomes than the electorates represented by those opposite in the metropolitan areas. So they have low household incomes, but also they have a disproportionately high percentage of their budget, their family budget, taken up by transport costs, personal transport costs in the case of using family cars, because the same people who use their cars the most are the very same people who have the least access to public transport. There is no other choice in most of our regional and rural electorates other than to use your own personal vehicle if you want to get around the community. So I look around the room here today, I see the member for Leichhardt, the member for Dawson, yourself, the member for Wright, the member for Moncrieff. Our communities are very dependent on personal transport, but also very dependent on a tourism recovery, which is quite fragile at the moment. We have seen a regional tourism recovery, a regional tourism boom brought about by the COVID pandemic where people couldn't travel overseas, but it is a fragile recovery and it relies very heavily on motoring holidays. The traditional family motoring holiday, the one that most people can afford, is to put the kids in the car, drive to the Gold Coast, drive to Mackay, drive to Cairns, in my case drive to Gippsland, drive to your beautiful electorate and spend some time together. So against this background, Deputy Speaker, where the international circumstances, the external circumstances haven't changed, the pressure on household budgets is enormous, and we're also seeing interest rate increases and other cost of living pressures, I urge the Treasurer to extend the fuel excise cut and give relief to Australian families. I acknowledge, Deputy Speaker, there are many calls on the budget and this is a difficult decision, but we need to keep families connected and we need to make sure this fragile recovery can continue. And anecdotally, I'm hearing reports of families where they're opting to take their children out of sport because the travel costs of going to training and the long distance of attending matches in regional areas is getting too hard for those families to sustain. And I'm also hearing reports of university students, and we think of communities like ours where kids often living 3 and 4 hours away from home are now making choices. Instead of coming home and catching up with their mates, catching up with their family every couple of weeks, they're delaying that to every 4 or 6 weeks. They're rationing their own contact with their own families because of fuel costs. The new government has the power to act.
I thank the honourable member for his contribution and give the call to the member for Scullion.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Today I rise to pay tribute to Mick and to Steve Dimos. 2 brothers, 2 true believers, 2 people who deserve to be remembered in this place. Mick and Steve sadly passed away recently, within weeks of each other. Steve on the 11th of June at the age of 86, Mick on the 19th of July at the age of 89. These brothers migrated here from Macedonia in their very early years and were the 3rd generation of their family to migrate to this country. Mick and Steve raised their families here, instilling in them the same values that guided them throughout their lives: commitment to teamwork, to sharing, to social justice and a desire to see fairness for all. They were soon, in this light, members of the Australian Labor Party, joining the Collingwood branch back in 1964 and were long-standing and active members of the Labor branch in the Scullion electorate. For Mick and for Steve, I know that one of their proudest moments was when they were awarded their 40-year life membership medallions in 2005. The brothers were well known to 4 generations of local Labor politicians, and they will be well remembered by each and every one of us as people who attended branch meetings and worked on every election campaign, who had a commitment to our cause that never wavered, who were always ready and willing to give their all to get their party elected. And importantly, and this is why it's so important to me that I remember Mick and Steve in this place, They were the very best of the movement that I am proud to serve in this place, because they gave so much while asking for nothing for themselves, save for the opportunity to contribute to a country that had given them something and to a movement that represented their ideal of how society should be. The contribution did not begin and end with the Labor Party. I want to acknowledge in particular their deep interest and commitment to the Macedonian Orthodox Church in the northern suburbs and broadly, a commitment that meant a lot to them and gave so much to so many. Their commitment more broadly to community is something that was well remembered, I think particularly at Mick's funeral last week that I was unable to attend due to my commitments in this place. But I know that many community members, as well as party members and union members, attended there in a mark of respect and solidarity. I think of Mick and Steve as two people who brought great meaning to my life through their friendship and their support. They are two people who I will miss greatly, and I know that many more will miss them more. So I say, Vale Mick, Vale Steve, and thank you for everything.
I thank the honourable member for his contribution and give the call to the honourable member for Dawson.
Deputy Speaker, I rise to speak about the importance of Vietnam Veterans Day and the coalition commitment that is close to my heart. A $5 million promise to build a Veterans Wellness Centre in my electorate of Dawson and the adjoining electorate of Capricornia, held by my colleague Michelle Landry. Both electorates have a proud history of service. Vietnam Veterans Day falls on the 18th of this month, which is also the anniversary of the Battle of Long Tan in 1966. This fierce battle took place in a rubber plantation near Nui Dat in South Vietnam, where a contingent of over 100 Australian soldiers, outnumbered by at least 10 to 1, managed to hold off a vastly superior Viet Cong attack, suffering the heaviest Australian casualties in a single engagement in Vietnam. Deputy Speaker, these men showed grit and determination to stand by their mates and uphold the Anzac spirit. We continue this great tradition by standing by our mates today. That is why I'm using this occasion to call on a new government to honour our commitment to provide veterans wellness centres in the Mackay region. These centres will be used by veterans, defence personnel and their families. They would also be available to first responders seeking some relief from the stresses of their work. Deputy Speaker, Veteran Wellbeing Centres provide a one-stop shop to connect veterans and first responders with support and advocacy services. We would not have the way of life that we all take for granted today if not for the sacrifices of our past and present members of our Defence Force and their families. This is an opportunity to show Australia is a society that values the idea of mates standing up with their mates. We owe it to our veterans, first responders and their families to build these centres. The $5 million commitment would go towards 2 centres in Mackay and a third at Kinchin Dam, west of the city, in the Capricornia electorate. Kinchin Dam is a beautiful part of the world that offers tranquility and respite for anyone fighting their own battles with conditions like PTSD. I look forward to working with Mackay RSL President Kenny Higgins and Kinchin Dam advocate Peter Worth to make these vital projects a reality. Our veterans need and deserve these centres. Deputy Speaker, I urge the new Labor government to honour the Anzac spirit and build these centres. We must stand by our mates.
I thank the honourable member for his contribution and give the call to the member for Solomon.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker, and I want to associate myself with the words of the former Speaker about the importance of us looking after our veterans. Deputy Speaker, on the weekend I was privileged to attend the Garma Festival at Gukla in North East Arnhem Land with the Prime Minister over the weekend. My first Garma Festival was while I was serving with Norforce in North East Arnhem Land back in 2007. and it was great to catch up with some of the Yolngu soldiers that I'd served with back at that time on their country. Great to be on Yolngu land and hear the Prime Minister lay out a clear pathway for establishing an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Also there were the Minister and Assistant Minister for Indigenous Australians, Pat Dodson, the Attorney-General and the Member for Lingiari, Marion Scrimgeour. And as the Prime Minister pointed out, the voice is not a matter of special treatment. It's about consulting First Nations people on the decisions that affect them. It's as simple as that. And it's really important for our country to take this step forward together, to be faced with the clear, direct question, and I quote, "Do you support an alteration to the Constitution that establishes an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice?" End quote. And to answer yes, there was a real spirit of joy and optimism at Garma. I think I've been to about 8 Garma festivals over the years, and it was wonderful to sit at the Bungal to watch the Yolngu dancers perform as they do with such power and grace, but also to see them joined on the Bungal by Ministers Burney and McCarthy, the member for Lingiari, and the NT Chief Minister Natasha Files, but also Minister Lawler and Minister Yubo. I entered the Bungal for a quick dance briefly, and it is a special place and a special thing to be part of, and I encourage all members to try and get to the Garma Festival at some time. And my constituent, Thomas Mayer, was there as well. He was a delegate to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and he's also written a book called Finding the Heart of Our Nation. This is what Thomas said about our government's commitment to the statement and of the Prime Minister's leadership.
Just to interrupt the member, a division has been called for in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend that division. The proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed and at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions. Yes, sir. I think it might even suspend automatically at 4:30.
I'll say you in a minute. We'll come back.
Yep.
Bound.
I thank the members. And in continuation, I give the call to the honourable member for Parkes.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'd like to bring to the House's attention the incredible achievement of Menindee grazier Brendan Cullen. This week, Brendan Cullen has just swum the English Channel. And what's amazing about Brendan's achievement was that he did all his training in Western New South Wales, in the Menindee Lakes. In the drought, he started this process some years ago and hasn't been able to fulfil it till now because of COVID and the travel restrictions. And so in the drought, the Menindee Lake system shrunk back to the smallest lake, Kopi Hollow, but there was sufficient water there for him to train and has finally joined that very, very exclusive club of people who have actually swum the English Channel. I haven't personally met Brendan. I'm looking forward to doing that, but I do know that he was motivated to start swimming because of finding a way to manage his mental health. You know, it's pretty grim out there. It hadn't rained for 3 or 4 years in Western New South Wales, and he found that the swimming was a great benefit to him with regards to his overall physical and mental health. And so, as a result, he was an ambassador for Lifeline Broken Hill, and that's an organisation that I'm very familiar with, who provides wonderful services to the people of the Far West. And so Brendan, in his swim, carried the mantle of Lifeline, and by doing that, highlighted the issues around the importance of well-being, mental and physical health well-being, and also highlighting that organisation that does such a great job in Broken Hill servicing the Far West. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, for an extraordinary story. Someone who started training in the middle of the worst drought on record in the Far West, training in the Menindee Lake system. I've got to say his last couple of months' training have been rather different. The lakes are actually at 100% now, and the countryside looks magnificent. Brendan used those systems. He did do some deep saltwater swimming in Port Phillip Bay, I believe, towards the end of his training system. So on behalf of myself and the Australian Parliament, I'd like to recognise Brendan Cullen for the great job that he's done.
I thank the honourable member for that contribution and give the call to the honourable member for Bendigo.
Thank you, Acting Deputy Speaker. Well, I rise to say a few words about the fact that it is National Homelessness Week. It's an opportunity for all of us to recognise the growing crisis that we have, not just in our electorates but across Australia, of far too many Australians finding themselves homeless. It is quite extreme what some people are having to go through. Just this week, I've had people contact my office and myself to share their experiences. A young family that have 2 children, not too much younger than my own, a 6-month-old and a 2-year-old, homeless, living with friends, hoping desperately to get a rental. They've applied for over 100 properties and yet to have been successful. This is one of many stories that all of us are hearing far too common. It used to be rare, but these days it's more and more. So this is a challenge that is complex because the solution is not a simple one. We need to increase the amount of social and community housing that we have, and our government has committed to do so, has committed to building more housing stock. We need to work with developers and to work on possible schemes where we are looking at a proportion of a development that goes towards low-cost or social and community housing, schemes that have been successful at state government levels. We need to work with local governments who are willing to put forward their own ideas, and I have an amazing commitment from the Mount Alexander Shire in my electorate who want to put forward the possibility of their old car park being turned into accommodation, being able to build small independent units on that block. They're just hoping that they can pull the state government, pull the federal government and pull a developer and a community not-for-profit all together to help make it happen. It's innovative thinking, but the way in which to make that project happen feels really complex. So we do need to get together at that local, state and federal level with community, with the industry on how we can get more housing stock built. We also need to look at areas like Airbnb and the impact that that has had. Whilst it might be great for people to have more affordable or have a home-like experience on their holidays, it has had an impact on our rental market. How much of an impact is something that I believe we need to investigate. These are issues that I'm raising, that lots of people are raising during Housing and Homelessness Week. And the last thing I'll say is we need to act urgently. Far too many people tonight and this week are homeless, whether they're couch surfing, whether they're staying with friends and family or living rough. More people need a place to call home.
I thank the honourable member for that contribution, and in accordance with the Standing Order 193, the time for members' constituency statement has now concluded. Call the clerk.
Private members' business. Order of the day number 1, Restoring Territory Rights Bill 2022, resumption of debate on the second reading.
I thank the clerk, and the question now before the House is that the bill now be read a second time, and I give the call to the honourable member for Burke.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to make a brief contribution in relation to this important piece of proposed legislation before us. And I speak just so that people can understand the position that I bring to this bill, a bill on which all members of this House and the Senate will have a free vote of conscience. I do support the principle of self-determination for a body politic, such as our states and our territories. I also support the principle of subsidiarity, something that we see vested in our constitution or arrangements, meaning that decisions should be taken as close to the people that will be affected by them as possible. And certainly as a Western Australian, that is something that we hold
close in our conception of a federation here in Australia. But along with that, and in that constitutional arrangement we see, the Commonwealth Constitution does vest certain powers in the Commonwealth. And it does that in a way where certain powers are exclusive to the Commonwealth, and it gives the Commonwealth power to constrain the exercise of power by the states in certain circumstances. And of course, that is even more so when it comes to our Australian territories, over which the Commonwealth Parliament has particular legislative responsibility. When it comes to this particular bill, in the way that I see this legislation, and I very much understand the purpose for which it has been brought forward by the members that have brought it forward and why they see this issue as important for the body politic of people that they represent in their territories. For me, all lives are sacred. And as I've watched and observed the debate around legislation that would bring into effect the ability for people to seek euthanasia, I have not been impressed by the legislation brought forward, both as a matter of principle, but also because looking at the legislation in each of the different jurisdictions, in my view, they are too risky. The safeguards are insufficient, sometimes in general and sometimes for people at specific risk. I also do believe that advancing down this pathway does and has the potential to put at risk the proper funding and support for palliative care across our various jurisdictions, and I believe that should really be the focus. So while I support the concept of self-government and actual self-government for our territories, right here today, in this respect of this bill, we are, and I am being asked to exercise a Commonwealth legislative power. That is a responsibility that we all hold as members of Parliament and as senators. And it's for the reasons that I've mentioned that I, in exercising that power, cannot in good conscience support this bill, and so I don't. But I do want to commend the members and senators from the Northern Territory and the Australian Capital Territory for bringing forward this legislation and for the government for allowing this debate to occur.
I thank the honourable member for Burt for that contribution and give the call to the honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak in support of this bill. At the heart of this legislation is the right of those Australians who live in the territories to decide, through their elected representatives, whether to enact laws with respect to voluntary assisted dying or euthanasia. I can't see any good reason why they should not have that right. Every state in Australia has passed legislation with respect to voluntary assisted dying. It seems absurd that Australian citizens, just a stone's throw away over the border in New South Wales, can debate and enact such laws, which they have chosen to do, but here in the ACT, that right is denied to their fellow Australian citizens. If this bill is passed, this legislative anomaly will be corrected, and the territories will have this right. For over a decade, I've been a strong supporter of the right of citizens in certain circumstances to choose to end their lives with dignity and at a time of their own choosing, with appropriate safeguards in place. It was in 2010 that I first really considered this issue in earnest. Towards the end of that year, I was diagnosed with stage 3 melanoma. Back in those days, there was very little in the way of post-operative treatment available. After the operation that I went through, I was told that the chances of the cancer coming back were 50-50, and that if it did so, there would not be very much that could be done. 50-50. It's a toss of the coin. I still remember where I was and what I was doing when I got that diagnosis. I can tell you, when you get news like that, it really focuses your mind. The first question you ask yourself is what will happen to your family and what life will be like for your children without you there to help raise them. Another question I ask myself during that time is what the end may look like and whether I would want the ability to choose the time and place of my passing. I decided without doubt that I would like that ability. I may or may not decide to act on it, but I would like to be able to make that choice. Fortunately for me, I've so far ended up on the right side of the ledger. I've had excellent care through Professor John Thompson at Melanoma Institute Australia and participated in a drug trial there for several years. I should add that Professor Thompson and his fellow cancer researchers are unsung heroes of our nation. While I appreciate that there are a wide range of opinions on this issue, my strong view remains that every Australian should have the right to choose the time of their own death in certain controlled circumstances. The New South Wales Parliament only recently passed its laws with respect to voluntary assisted dying, and as I have said, every state in Australia has done so. Both the Australian Capital Territory and Northern Territory Self-Government Acts provide that their legislative assemblies have the power to make laws for the peace, order and good government of each respective territory. It's not only incongruous but illogical that there should be an exclusion with respect to the issue of voluntary assisted dying. The legislative assemblies of the ACT and Northern Territories have clearly demonstrated that they are capable of responsibly debating, formulating and implementing policies with respect to this issue. Statehood need not be, and clearly should not be, a precondition for that to occur. I support this bill and, in so doing, the rights of our fellow Australians in the ACT and the Northern Territory to have the same freedom to legislate on this issue that other Australians possess. I commend this bill to the House.
I thank the honourable member for his contribution and respectfully give the call to the honourable member for Blair.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. This private member's bill removes the limitations imposed by the Euthanasia Laws Act of 1997 on the rights of the ACT, that's Australian Capital Territory and the Northern Territory, to consider laws that they might pass in their capacity relating to voluntary assisted dying. All states have passed laws allowing voluntary assisted dying, and this private member's bill restores the power to the ACT and the Northern Territory to consider laws in relation to the same. The bill before the chamber today is not about passing a law to impose voluntary assisted dying, also known as euthanasia. If this chamber and the Senate voted for this bill, it would not permit people to make decisions to end their lives surrounded by family and friends when suffering terminal illness and the consequent pain experienced thereby. Like so many in this place, I've witnessed the grievous and long-standing suffering of family and friends where pain is awful and unbearable and all personal dignity lost. These things are deeply personal, ethically challenging and even spiritually confronting. I have genuine concerns about the prospect of elder abuse and the legal protections necessary to avoid the same. These are decisions which have to be made by my colleagues at state level. We need to do better in this country on palliative care. As long ago as September 2014, the Grattan Institute's report Dying Well pointed out that 70% of Australians want to die at home, but only 14% do so. Dying in Australia is more institutionalised than any comparable country that we think about, such as New Zealand, the United States, France or Ireland. In Ipswich, in my home city, we have good palliative care delivered by charitable institutions in people's homes. Palliative care unit at the Ipswich General Hospital and the locally beloved institution known as Ipswich Hospice. But we need to do better in this country, and we need to do much more when it comes to palliative care. I do not think that this bill rules out doing better in terms of palliative care. It would not be our role to basically decide these things in terms of euthanasia or voluntary assisted dying if we pass this bill. This is an act of Parliament that seeks to undo something which happened 25 years ago, and that is imposing a Commonwealth prohibition in the territories. It seems very odd to me that the Parliament did this. Our federation is not fossilised. It's living, evolving, it's changing all the time. It's changed by referenda, by High Court decisions, by cooperative federalism, historically known as the COAG process and often called the National Cabinet these days. This is not to suggest that there are not problems with voluntary assisted dying legislation in states and territories. If we're to look at our constitution when it was first conceived, and people like Barton and Parkes and Deakin and others who were involved in it, and they were all blokes at the time, by the way, conservative or liberal blokes, it would assume that Western Australia may not join the Federation and that New Zealand would be a state of Australia. But we know what happened in the end. WA was in as a state, and New Zealand is a separate nation to us. Those opposite have long championed states' rights, but to listen to some of their speeches in this place, they support states when convenient, but territories scarcely at all. Some of those opposites seem to want to maintain and even expand Commonwealth power. Robert Menzies must be turning in his grave. I say to those opposite, what rights for Territorians? What do you wish to prescribe or proscribe? What responsibilities do you wish to strip from these territories, now or in the future? In this country now, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, Western Australia, South Australia and Tasmania have the power, the jurisdiction to make laws in relation to assisted dying. In other words, it's a state responsibility. But for Australians living in the ACT or the Northern Territory, it's a responsibility of the federal government. This makes no sense at all to me, whether in geography or demography. Section 122 of the Constitution is being invoked by those opposed to this bill, but the federal government does have the power to pass laws in relation to the ACT and the Northern Territory. That is a strange thing to do with our federation. But I don't accept the arguments on political maturity, nor can the absence of an upper house be a reason not to return these rights to Territorians. My home state of Queensland has not had an upper house for 100 years, yet members of the Queensland Parliament could make these decisions upon mature reflection and debate. Frankly, I don't think the fact that the Commonwealth Parliament has a Senate is the best argument against this bill. In any event, for the many, many decades after the upper house was brought in the colonies and indeed in the states, the presence of the landed gentry and the business establishment infested the upper houses of the states and territory, often elected without a democratic franchise and often without one vote, one value. So don't give me this nonsense about the absence of an upper house in the states and territories. For some in this bill, this is about euthanasia, to which they have a religious, spiritual or philosophical objection. I do not have such objections, although I do have concerns and serious concerns about euthanasia, about the protection of the weak, the vulnerable and the suffering, how this can be done with full autonomy and cognitive capacity. But this is a matter for those politicians who do or should have the right to make those laws in respect of these things. In my faith tradition, there are plenty of people who allege belief in absolutes on certain issues, as if there's a litmus test on the veracity and fidelity to faith. Life is sacred, they have said, and I've heard this argued in this place. Forgetting the almost genocidal, homicidal, infanticide and regicide that we see in parts of the Old Testament. Look in Genesis or Joshua or Judges. I'm more of a New Testament Christian myself. It's possible to believe in the fundamentals of faith without being a fundamentalist. Now, Deputy Speaker, I read the Bible every day, almost every day, since I became a Christian at the age of 16 years of age in the back pew of my Baptist church. I do not think this is a matter of spiritual absolutism. The God I believe in is a God of love, who wants us to love one another, who tells us, in the words of St Paul of Tarsus, to live the 9 visible attributes of the Christian life: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness and self-control. Those virtues could do with a bit more adherence in this place. With respect, I don't see this as a debate about the sanctity of human life or a similar issue. I see this debate for what it is in the papers on this bill. It's about whether people in Darwin or Canberra should have the same rights to self-government and self-determination and legislative decision-making as people in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, or even in my home city of Ipswich. These Australians, these Territorians, should be able to decide this issue for themselves and not subject to the dictates of people who don't live there, such as myself or most of us in this place. In summary, Deputy Speaker, I'm voting for this bill. It's a tough decision for people of faith, I know. It's a conscience vote. I'm voting for territory rights, and so that all Australians, no matter where they can live, can decide this issue for themselves. They'll have their debates in their chambers. It'll be passionate and well fought, and people will no doubt give good arguments one way or the other. But it's in their legislative assemblies where it should be, not in this place. I'm a Queenslander. The Queensland Parliament has passed laws on this issue. The people of the ACT and the Northern Territory should do so or not do so. It should be their decision. They should decide this for themselves, and for that reason I'm supporting this bill.
I thank the member for your contribution, and I call the member for Berowra.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. This is not the first time I've risen in this place to speak on this matter. Every few years the old arguments are dusted off and freshened up when someone wants to raise the flag on this issue or thinks the numbers might finally be in their favour to turn the tables on this matter. Last Parliament I said I rose with a heavy heart. Today the weight is doubled. I'm sad that we are fighting what I sense will be a losing battle. I think in time we will look back on this as a huge mistake. But even if the bill is passed, I will not regret standing here today and being counted. There are times in your life when doing so is important, and today for me is absolutely one of those days. I'm standing to speak about something that I know at the very core of my being is wrong. We've seen in the past that where this goes is monstrous. There's nothing about what we're doing today that is enlightened or compassionate, even though the proponent's intention may be to do so. What we are doing is ripping apart the values our society stood for as we rip apart these laws. I want to directly address the argument that's been made by the mover of this bill, the member for Solomon. He's argued that this is just about territory rights and not about euthanasia. Though I have great respect for the member for Solomon, I could not disagree with him more. This bill endorses no other right than the right to kill his fellow Territorians. We hear a lot about territory rights. Well, I can't think of any political movement in history that has asked for rights and freedoms in order to kill people. This is a perversion of what liberty is about, and we should be deeply troubled by the idea that we are crossing this line. Let me be clear, this bill only deals with one right, and that is the right to pass euthanasia laws in the territories. The Northern Territory and the ACT are territories, not states. There are reasons why the Federal Parliament has additional responsibility over these places. In 1998, the Northern Territory voted against statehood. It chose to be a territory, and it did so recognising the ongoing supervisory jurisdiction of the Commonwealth. Both the Northern Territory and the ACT have no upper house, no House of Review, and laws can be rushed through incredibly quickly. It should not be within the remit of the territory governments to authorise the death of their citizens. As the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, I'm particularly concerned about the implications of euthanasia on Indigenous people. Indigenous Australians facing high rates of disease are particularly vulnerable to euthanasia legislation, and the Territory Government cannot be trusted to manage the introduction of something like euthanasia in a way that will have anything near the necessary safeguards. We've seen that the Territory Government has been completely incapable of managing alcohol restrictions in communities at the end of the Stronger Futures legislation, and the consequences have been devastating. Instead of creating a situation in which restrictions were in place unless opted out of, the Territory removed restrictions automatically. The Northern Territory Government's failures are causing massive increases in domestic and sexual violence and hospital administrations. Given the record of the Northern Territory Government, how can we expect something like the introduction of euthanasia will be properly managed with adequate safeguards and will not have devastating consequences in these places? Euthanasia also runs counter to the values and beliefs of many Indigenous Australians. Many Aboriginal leaders have been clear that euthanasia is fundamentally at odds with their culture. In 1996, at the introduction of the Northern Territory euthanasia laws, they were met with strong opposition from Indigenous people. As Dr Diniyini Gondara OAM told the Senate committee at the time, it does not fit into our customary law. It seems to be seen as a form of sorcery, that you're doing something to somebody else. You cannot create a law within a parliament to take somebody else's life. In 1996, Chips McAnulty was commissioned by the Northern Territory Government's Aboriginal Steering Committee to go to Aboriginal communities and to record people's views on the Rights of the Terminally Ill Act, to feedback to government. 21 community meetings were conducted across the Territory with about 900 people participating, and the results were virtually unanimous. Only 2 participants expressed support for the legislation, and at every single meeting, people were strongly opposed to the legislation. Indigenous leaders also voiced strong opposition when Western Australia introduced euthanasia. Senator Pat Dodson and Ken Wyatt both opposed the law in their state, recognising the significant risk it presents to Indigenous people and the lack of meaningful consultation that had taken place. Ananu Pitjantjatjara woman Melissa Thompson wrote to WA MPs saying she was deeply concerned about the legislation. She said the last thing we all Aboriginal people need is another avenue to death. I don't want another death sentence, she said, for all my people and all of Australia. Senator Pat Dodson has rightly argued that we must work harder to achieve stronger health outcomes for Aboriginal Australians, instead of introducing laws to help them end their life. In 2018, he told the Senate, and I quote, "More needs to be done to ensure that First Nations people are receiving palliative care within their communities. Where First Nations people are already overrepresented at every stage of our health system, it is irresponsible to vote in favour of another avenue to death. Paving the way for euthanasia and assisted suicide leaves First Nations people even more vulnerable when our focus should be on working collectively to create laws that help prolong life and restore their right to enjoy a healthy life." Can I say, Deputy Speaker, we should listen to our elders. In both territories, more palliative care services are needed. During 2020-2021, Western Australia accessed MBS-funded palliative care services at 10 times the rate of the Northern Territory and at near twice the rate of people at the ACT. As Dr Michael Casey, Chief Executive of the PM Glynn Institute, says, "People say voluntary assisted dying is about giving patients a choice, but if dying patients cannot access the palliative care services they need, they really don't have a free choice. We need to do more to ensure that everyone who needs good quality palliative care can access it, wherever they are and whatever their circumstances, before considering a momentous step like euthanasia." In my view, no parliament in Australia should have euthanasia on its statute books, and yet since 2017 every state has passed legislation to make euthanasia lawful. Euthanasia laws in Australia are young, but they're already leaving a significant mark. In Victoria, 331 people have died in the first 2 years following the introduction of the law. Advocates there predicted there would only be 12 people a year when the law first came in. In Western Australia, 171 people were euthanased from the commencement of their law in 2019 to May 2022. In the latest report from Victoria covering the period January to June 2021, the youngest applicant for euthanasia was 18. 18. Every other state has now legalised euthanasia and is waiting for that law to come into effect. In a few short years, our definition of what makes life meaningful and our understanding of the value of life have been quietly and significantly altered. One of the catch cries of modern politics is that we should listen to the experts. Well, why are the same people who chant that mantra ignoring the Australian Medical Association who continue to oppose such laws? Very soon it will be normal for Australians to consider the idea that they might end their own life. With this law, we are fundamentally changing the relationship that people have with government and the compact that we have with one another. There is never a time in which a person's life is expendable. The consequences are broader than we would like to believe them to be. When we look at the international experience, we see too that there's a contagion effect over time and more people choose to end their lives themselves when facing terminal illness. In Oregon, where euthanasia was first legalised, an average of 34 people died each year for the first 10 years. Now an average of 134 people die each year. In the Netherlands, 4.4% of deaths were from euthanasia in 2017, compared to 1.9% of deaths when the law was introduced in 1990. Legalising euthanasia means people who may have never considered ending their life now find themselves presented with that option. Other jurisdictions also show the tendency for the conditions under which it's permitted to grow looser as time goes on. Today, some might accept that terminal illness can make life unbearable such that it should be ended. Tomorrow, we start to wonder if perhaps a permanent severe disability, the sort that makes you unable to speak or toilet yourself, makes life so unbearable that it should end. And next, we wonder about mental illness. If someone suffers from depression, should that be a reason too to say, "I've had enough"? I'm not talking here about a fantasy world, Deputy Speaker. That road is precisely the one that has been walked in places that legalised euthanasia many years ago. Today in the Netherlands, euthanasia is available to children, to people with dementia and mental illness rather than just physical disabilities. In Canada, within 5 years, the categories of people accessing euthanasia expanded to include people with disabilities, even though they don't have a fatal condition. How can we tolerate the idea that a disabled person's life should not be defended with as much fervour as an able-bodied person? As Dr John Fox, a disability advocate in New Zealand, argued during that country's recent euthanasia debate, why is it that a 25-year-old fit and healthy rugby player goes to a doctor and says he wants to end his life, and he's referred to all sorts of services to help him find meaning and hope again? But if a 25-year-old disabled man goes to a doctor and says he wants to end his life, he's offered help to do so. It's not compassionate to tell the suffering person that their life is not worth fighting for. It's not a kindness to leave people in a position which they find themselves considering ending their life in order to prevent themselves being a burden. Now, I know that's not the motivation for those who argue for euthanasia, although I do believe the consequences are very real. I do want to acknowledge that the motivation for euthanasia legislation is often a deep desire to alleviate suffering. There's enormous strength of feeling in the arguments for euthanasia and the innumerable stories that lie beneath the discussion we have today. Many people sitting through the debate fill their minds with the image of the last days of someone they've loved, someone whose suffering they'd do anything to alleviate. Some of us sitting here know that buried in the code of our own DNA is the potential of a terrifying illness, the sort that would mean a long, slow deterioration with all our capacity slipping away at a pace that seems too slow to bear. The suffering of life is real, and the terror of facing our bodies falling perhaps slowly, messily and painful is real. And yet, what we debate today is not just the end of life for ourselves and the people we love, but it's a very real decision about how we define how meaningful and valuable a person's life is when they're at their most vulnerable. I believe our compassion must be stronger and deeper than passing this law would enable. We must commit ourselves to the best care we can manage for those who are sick. We must hold the value of a person's life even when they can no longer see it for themselves. In Oregon, detailed statistics have been kept for years, including about what has motivated a person to end their own life. The top 5 reasons do not include pain, but do include a feeling people are a burden on their family and friends. In February this year, a woman in Canada with multiple chemical sensitivities, a condition affected by chemicals and smoke, decided to end her life through euthanasia. 8 days before her medically assisted death, she filmed herself saying, "The government sees me as expendable trash, a complainer, useless." In Australia, we've seen a significant rise in mental illness and suicide over recent years, and we know many people, particularly older Australians, are vulnerable as they wait for months to receive services. It's not alarmist to acknowledge that legalising euthanasia makes people even more vulnerable. And we also know that medical advice can change. Treatments can be found, medical assessment about a prognosis can be wrong. While there is life, there is hope. In the last Parliament, I spoke about how we continue to see the remnants of a life-affirming culture across our Australian society. I've always believed that we are a society with a culture that believes in the sanctity of life and the dignity of the human person, based on our Judeo-Christian values. Such a culture values individual human life and sees it as sacred, as I do. We see the remnants of our life-affirming culture across our society, from the campaign to reduce our road toll, to the public and private funding of medical research, to find ways to keep people healthy and prolong life. We see it in the commitments of all governments, 10 billion annually to prevent suicide. We saw it during COVID as we committed ourselves to taking action that would keep people safe and alive, no matter their age or health status, shutting down large parts of our country for 2 years just to save lives. But these remnants of the life-affirming culture are disappearing inch by inch and soul by soul, and the decision we're making with this bill cripples our culture even more. And in this regard, and in a very personal sense, I cannot forget what the most civilised and enlightened society in Europe, which wiped out 6 million of my people in the Holocaust, began their program of industrial murder by euthanasing vulnerable disabled people thought to be in pain. I cannot in good conscience know this history and say nothing. The law impacts who we are and what our culture looks like going forward. It operates as a standard setter and as a teacher, and this law endorses a cultural change that I'd hoped we would never see. I want to finish, Deputy Speaker, with the words of Dylan Thomas that I quoted last time I spoke on these issues in this place. It's galling to me that the proponents of euthanasia have called their organisation Go Gentle to make their case. They're turning on their head, in my view, all that Thomas was saying in his famous poem. Indeed, Deputy Speaker, I think we should rage for life. We must rage for life. As Dylan Thomas wrote, do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
I thank the member. And I call the member for Ryan.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The 1997 decision by John Howard's coalition government to prevent territory governments passing assisted dying laws was always cynical, undemocratic and inhuman. In order to shoot down a decision that they were ideologically opposed to, they robbed the territories of basic democratic rights and held back progress on voluntary assisted dying laws, causing needless suffering for so many families for the past 25 years. As with too many decisions made here, there was so little regard for the human cost, so little regard for the misery caused by those elected to serve the people. It's shameful. I want to say that the Greens have a long track record of supporting territory rights. Over a decade ago, the Greens passed a territory rights bill, but it was reversed by the Abbott government. It's a basic question of equity. Currently, residents of the territories are being treated as second-class citizens. If citizens of the states are allowed to access voluntary assisted dying schemes, citizens of the territories should be allowed to do the same. And I might add, this should also be the case for other constitutional laws passed by democratically elected bodies. How is it that people in, say, the Northern Territory have less capacity to make decisions in their collective interests than people in Queensland or New South Wales? This proposal should not even be controversial. This cynical decision from the Howard years is not compatible with a basic respect for democracy. If people who live in states are allowed access to voluntary assisted dying schemes, the same rights need to be extended to the territories. Territory rights are fundamental Greens values, and it's a core Greens policy that individuals have the right to make self-governing choices. While this bill won't in itself reinstate the Northern Territory's voluntary assisted dying legislation from 1995 that was callously overridden by the Howard government in 1997, it will clear the obstacle for new legislation to be brought to that effect. For years now, the Greens have been at the forefront in states and territories of the fight to deliver on assisted dying laws and give people in unbearable pain choices around their death. Since being elected in 2017, my colleague in Queensland State Parliament, Michael Berkman, has been working very closely with the community to ensure that VAD was legislated last year in my home state. We've also seen the Greens work with groups like Dying with Dignity and other important community voices to help deliver VAD laws in Victoria, Tasmania, Western Australia and this year in New South Wales. We do this work because we believe this is a fundamental right for people. Terminally ill people in pain have a right to choose to die with dignity. And I want to point out that having a right to voluntary assisted dying simply means giving people a choice. Voluntary assisted dying is just one of many options, and having it on the table can give peace of mind, even though only a tiny minority of patients will actually use it. It means that those in pain have options available to them if and when they need them. This gives both reassurance that suffering is not inevitable, as well as access to this option where needed. The Victorian Parliamentary Inquiry into End-of-Life Choices, Final Report 2016, acknowledged that simply having the option to choose assisted dying has a palliative effect in and of itself by enabling people at the end of life to reclaim control of their situation. Importantly, voluntary assisted dying also gives people the chance to say goodbye to family and friends. And finally, regulated VAD gives a clear framework for doctors and healthcare workers when dealing with terminal patients in immense pain who want to die. Of course, appropriate safeguards should be in place, Inbuilt protections in the scheme mean VAD is only available to those who really need it, and there are appropriate checks to ensure they are of sound mind. Appropriate safeguards and regulations in this area protect the vulnerable and protect healthcare workers from inappropriate requests. Opponents of these laws will tell you that improved palliative care is the answer, but this is not the view of the medical profession. Doctors and patients have for many years now been advising us that palliative care alone is not sufficient. Regulated VAD with appropriate safeguards is overwhelmingly supported by medical professionals. Of course, palliative care should be expanded, but there will still be cases that are deeply distressing for families and patients, where the pain relief offered and the sheer indignity of the illness will not be meaningfully ameliorated by palliative care. So there's no medical, moral or political argument for holding back VAD legislation. It's been introduced in most states across Australia now. It's high time the territories are given back the right to pass this kind of crucial legislation. We're in a situation now where in the Northern Territory, a person in unbearable suffering must have this suffering prolonged against their expressed wishes, all because politicians in this place 25 years ago made a cynical political decision. And the Territory Government has no recourse to change this situation. This bill finally gives Australia the chance to correct this wrong and give the people of the Territories the ability to put and pass new legislation on crucial issues like voluntary assisted dying. Thank you.
I thank the member for Ryan and I call the member for Hughes.
Deputy Speaker, I rise to give support to the Restoring Territory Rights Bill of 2022. Having recently observed the passing of the Voluntary Assisted Dying Act in my home state of New South Wales, I was relieved to note that all states in our country of Australia have now embraced some form of voluntary assisted dying legislation for people dealing with the most painful of illnesses and the resulting undignified final moments of their lives. However, as amendments to the Australian Capital Territory Self-Government Act of 1988 and the Northern Territory Self-Government Act of 1978 established, the autonomous governing of our territories was restricted to prevent any potential for either the ACT or the Northern Territory to ever enact similar voluntary assisted dying legislation without the resolution of this parliament. In my first speech, delivered in the House last Thursday, 28th of July, I spoke of the liberal philosophies of John Stuart Mill and the harm principle. I realise that I will not be the only member of this place making reference to Mr Mill, but I believe his principles warrant mention nonetheless. It is the job of government to clear the way for its citizens to act in whatever way they may choose, so long as those actions do not negatively affect the lives of others. We all have stories, Deputy Speaker, of friends, family members and other loved ones whom we have seen live through a terminal illness, one whose suffering creates such a painful condition that cannot be tolerably relieved. We witness our parents and grandparents spending the last months of their lives in dreadful pain with no prospects of recovery. The memories of the suffering of these people will be forever etched in the minds of their families as the last ounce of their dignity drifts away. I make note, Deputy Speaker, that this bill does not require any new legislation to be enacted by either of the territories. Accordingly, I believe in self-determination. Constituents of the ACT and the Northern Territory are responsible enough to elect their own territory parliamentary representatives. They presumably should be deemed responsible enough to enact legislation relevant to the needs and desires of their people. Other states, all states throughout this country, have set a safe, rational and controlled example of voluntary assisted dying provisions, which would undoubtedly be deemed persuasive to territory legislatures in crafting their own reforms. Deputy Speaker, this bill is not and never will be a support of state-sanctioned murder. As displayed by the legislation passed by every state in this country, individual decision-making by the patient is paramount. The patient must have capacity and must be free from external coercion. There must be all of the safeguards in place that include appropriate assistance and consultation with medical practitioners. Voluntary assisted dying legislation enshrines freedom. It is the freedom of a person facing imminent death to seek support in their decision. It is also the freedom of a medical practitioner to refrain from offering that support, and the freedom of institutions, now and into the future, to refuse to provide assistance to assistance dying. Indeed, passing legislation related to voluntary assisted dying will not impinge on the rights of those that don't want to choose this pathway. However, not supporting such legislation will deny that option for those that do. Vigorous yet respectful debates have been held in the various states of our country around voluntary assisted dying. It is now appropriate that our territorial parliamentarians be similarly able to avail themselves of the opportunity to discuss, debate and, if appropriate, enact legislation regarding voluntary assisted dying. Deputy Speaker, I have been inundated over the past week or so by people within my electorate of Hughes asking that I endorse this bill. In those circumstances, Deputy Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.
I thank the member. And I call the member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. This bill purports to be about territory rights. It is, in my view, a very clean handball. It is, in fact, about voluntary euthanasia. I think there is only one issue outstanding around the issue of states' rights or territory rights in this case, and it is this voluntary euthanasia. As you would well know, this job we have, Madam Deputy Speaker, entails us meeting hundreds of people. Most of them are good. The vast majority of them are good. But not all of them are. And the longer I'm in this job, sadly, we meet some of the worst. And I'm always appalled when I see families squabbling over inheritances that have not yet occurred. And they do come to our office from time to time. Families lined up to get their hands on mum or dad's money. Some children have got themselves in a position of having power of attorney or even enduring power of attorney over mum or dad and actually sell up mum's house without letting her know. I've had that. And it makes you really question the fundamental goodness of people, you know, whether it is there in every character. But I do know that those people that are offended should be protected at every possibility. Others who convince mum and dad to underwrite their latest business venture. I'm sure you've come across that one, Madam Deputy Speaker, and the business venture has gone sour and mum or dad lose their house. They lose the lot. And siblings already positioning themselves for the carve-up. And this thing within the Euthanasia Acts around Australia which say that the person choosing euthanasia should be of sound mind and able to exercise their own judgment and be not influenced by others in that judgment is of course sound thinking. That makes sense. But how hard is it to convince an elderly parent, oh, maybe it's not worth all the trouble, Mum. You know how your last operation went and Helen and I had to come up here and see you. It's a long way for us to travel. We've got families, and you know how much pain you had, and you know something else is probably going to go wrong with you if you have this operation. Make no mistake, as I said, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is about this bill, the one we're facing here towards the House, which thankfully, I thank Peter Dutton and our leadership team for making this a conscience vote in the Coalition Party room, is about voluntary euthanasia. Now, I lay on the table that I am a practising Christian. I don't go to church quite as often as I should, but I try and get there. In fact, I went to St Peter's Anglican Cathedral in Adelaide last Sunday. I'm not an Anglican, but I've never been inside that wonderful cathedral. And I can tell you, this really isn't a time for levity, but I can tell you when you sit in there on a winter's morning, you're as far from the fires as hell as one could possibly imagine. It was freezing. But as I said, I'm a practising Christian, but I don't actually bring a particular religious view to this debate about voluntary euthanasia. I'm not sure what the Bible said to us in that case, and I don't bring that judgment. I understand that many people don't see the Bible as their guiding force in life. So I take it really just as an issue of human rights and trying to protect the rights of those who I think need protection as they get older. I think it is a dishonesty in this bill to claim that it's about the territory rights. So on that issue of territory rights, and Section 122 of the Constitution provides that the Commonwealth has the plenary power to legislate for the territories. And I make the point that in the case of the Northern Territory, at least, it was in 1995 that this bill was enacted, but in fact it was in 1998 or 1998 that the citizens of the Northern Territory actually rejected that right to become a state. They rejected the opportunity in a referendum. So perhaps they didn't want to make this decision on a lot of other decisions that go with statehood, and it was ceded to the Commonwealth. I mean, they knew in 1995 that the Commonwealth had taken this position of saying that on these issues we will have the say here in Canberra. And in 1998, the people of the Territory had an opportunity to say, well, we reject that, we'll become a state within our own right. They chose not to. And so the power does reside here because they chose not to take that pathway to statehood. On euthanasia in particular, I'd have to say that it's something I thought was a voluntary euthanasia, I must say. I thought was a good idea when I was younger. I would have argued the case of voluntary euthanasia probably many times at 2 o'clock in the morning after I consumed a couple of bottles of red with some mate. And the point being that we didn't have the responsibility for the decision within that debate. Part of growing up, isn't it? Maybe becoming a member of the House of the Parliament of Australia is a major step in our growing up, because you know that the decisions we make here actually make a difference in people's lives, and you have to own the result. A little later on this evening, I will be speaking about the government's intention to abolish the cashless debit card, for all intents and purposes, and they will have to own whatever results come from that decision. And so if we make a decision in this place, which is, as I said, a de facto decision to introduce or to allow for voluntary euthanasia in the territories, well, in fact, we have to take ownership of that decision. It's not an ownership that I'm prepared to take. I think you can't be on the right side of every argument, and I mean that in an individual sense. And I know there are people that have been through this terrible case of watching a loved one die, and they will say to people like me, you wouldn't let a dog live through this existence. Why don't you allow for the said person to issue an instruction to end their life? And in those terms, I don't disagree with that argument, and I understand why they reached that position. It's just as I've pointed out that we see the other side of it as well, and I find it difficult to be 100% confident that we won't see a distortion of that decision. We need to take that responsibility for people who maybe aren't as in control of their lives as they might say they are, that maybe have been coerced. And I think the risks are too high, because if there is one person that is taken from this world against their will, under legislation that we basically are voting for or against here in this Parliament today or tomorrow or whenever it comes, well, I think that will be an error there that is obviously unreversible. So I will be not supporting the bill that comes through. I suspect it'll pass. I think it'll probably pass quite well, but I'll be able to sleep with my conscience. Thank you.
I thank the member, and I call the member for New England.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Deputy Speaker, and I rise to also say this is a bill about euthanasia, however you want to put it. It's a bill about euthanasia from a territory that chose that they did not want to be a state. And I also note that in the territories we're probably going to most likely find those who are the most vulnerable to mistakes that become part of this process. I have a very strong philosophical position. I've never hidden it. I don't think that anybody has the right to kill another person, whether that person is aware of their rights or not. You do not have the right to kill another person unless they're a clear and imminent threat to yourself, such as what we see in times of conflict, a defence force or a policeman or woman. But to say to a person, my objective now in life is to make sure that I kill you, and that is what they're doing, they're killing, I kill you, I think debases who we are. I've just gone through the process of nursing with my family, my father, who passed away last week. He was 98 and a half years old. He was bedridden, and we looked after Dad for 4 years. And prior to that, my mother had a stroke and looked after Mum. It's my own personal view. That added to my life. It didn't detract. That person was, my father was an incredible asset. Obviously I miss him dearly, but it was imperative at times. Yes, it was hard work, really, really hard work. And obviously with issues of their own personal hygiene, it's tough. It can be really tough. And you know, I want to acknowledge the work done by especially Rebecca, who was almost a saint looking after him, and my sister and brothers. It would have been so easy though, because sometimes your loved ones are not so loving. And as they are not so loving, they can be...
As Chair, I advise that a division has been called in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions.
And I invite the member for New England to resume his speech.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. So one of the issues we have with euthanasia is sometimes patients' loved ones are not that lovely now, and this is an issue, and especially in a place like the Northern Territory where duress will come into play. What do I base that on, Mr Deputy Speaker? I base it on the experience of places such as the Netherlands. I now wish to quote to you one of the issues that was happening in the Netherlands, and I got this from The Guardian, so I'm not getting it from some crazy right-wing scribe. Van Baasten's scruples have crystallised in the country's first euthanasia malpractice case, where prosecutors are now preparing, 3 further cases are currently under investigation. It involves a dementia sufferer who asked to be killed when the time was right. But when her doctor judged this to be the case, she resisted. The patient had to be drugged and restrained by her family before she finally submitted to the doctor's fatal injection. The doctor who administered the dose, who has not been identified, has defended her actions by saying that she was fulfilling her patient's request, and that since the patient was incompetent, her protests before her death were irrelevant. Now, we don't think of the Netherlands as a backwater. We don't think this is an unsophisticated country. They're one of the first in this area, and what this does show quite clearly, Mr Deputy Speaker, is the progression of where these issues end up. Now, the whole point of medicine is the preservation of life, not the destruction of life. And this can, in other reports, we can see this extended into other areas. Now, it is a very cheap form of palliative care, is euthanasia. And it also inherently will give rise to people basically putting words in other people's mouths of, of course, when you're ready to go, just let us know. Life must be hard for you. It must be tough. You must feel like you're a burden. And I imagine that, I'm very blessed and very lucky to have a great family, but I imagine other areas, to be quite frank. My father's life would have been one that people would have put pressure on. Because they say, you're in the house all day. People have to stay in the house with you. It locks up finances. Things can't go anywhere. And, we have to focus, and we have to also remember that the views of people at a certain point in their life, as has been noted by the previous speaker, may not be their views at a later time in their life. That, the view of the person is contingent on the mercurial nature of human conscience. And that can change over time and how they perceive life. I think it's really important that our endeavours at a medical area do not have as an option that this facility will assist you to kill yourself. And one of the biggest problems with that is because someone has to assist you. That inherently goes down a path where we become sort of arbitrary and I think hard. We lose a section of our humanity. The issues with palliative care now, there are so many things that we can do. There are so many things that we can do to aid a person at the final stages of their life, which will happen to all of us. But of course, but this is where our endeavours must be focused, not on sort of the shortcut of, we'll kill you. Now, what we also have now is that in part of the European experience, the psychiatric disorders are now being deemed as a mechanism of removing the hardship of life, removing and that can be schizophrenia as a reason for euthanasia. It can be, there's one where there was obesity. Now these are not circumstances that bring unbearable pain, but they can be determined and be utilised as a mechanism for a person to bring about the termination of a person's life. And I quote, between October 2007 and December 2011, 100 people went to the clinic in Belgium's Dutch-speaking region with depression or schizophrenia, or in several cases Asperger's syndrome, seeking euthanasia. The doctors satisfied that 48 of the patients were in earnest and that their conditions were untreatable and unbearable. Now, How do you end up at that point? And I hope that shocks people to say that's an absurdity, that's wrong. Because they started from the extreme and extreme cases of terminal cancer. But that's where it starts. All these things start in a spot. Where they end up is somewhere entirely different. So to stop that boulder rolling down a hill, you don't give it a push at the start. And when you go down the path of euthanasia, you've given the boulder a little push. And where it ends up, it's entirely different to where your aspirations are later on. And why this is more pertinent to the Northern Territory, of course, is we have so many problems there that we've got to manage. We have child molestation, which is a problem has got to be fixed. Alcoholism, drug addiction, unemployment, extreme violence in communities, extreme violence. And so what do they all point to? Why do these social maladies exist? Because there is a febrile insecurity and vulnerability there. So why would you insert into that the option of euthanasia? Anybody should be able to diagnose this, that you're opening yourself up for something at some stage where inevitably someone who is vulnerable will be killed. And if you really looked into that person's heart at that moment and said, and I've been there before, where I've said to a person as they had the PAP mask on, and it was my brother, and they wanted to take it off, and I said, Tim, do you want to die? And he looked at me and went, no, I don't. And I said, well, that's the answer. The answer is no, I don't. And if that meant another half hour of life, another hour of life, another day of life, but you don't want the pressure on that person. That person, it's got to be not an alternative. You don't want that pressure because it will happen. And some people will, not a person, but people will be killed who don't want to die, who just don't want to die. But in the pressure of people surrounding them, they will convince themselves that they're an inconvenience. By wink and by nod, by inference, by innuendo, by a whole range of mechanisms, they'll be convinced that they're an inconvenience. And so to help other people out, they will give up the most precious thing that they have, their life. Their life. So in any way, shape or form, no matter what form it comes into this parliament, I will fight against euthanasia as an alternative. Not so much for where it starts, but where I know it will finish. And if anybody can show me an example in Europe where it's not the case, then let's hear it, because I can certainly show you the cases where it is. And they all started from a righteous position, and now the discussions are something entirely different. And if someone says, we can put the caveat, we are wiser in Australia and we'll put the caveats in place where this will not happen. No, you won't. Australia's just like everywhere else. It'll follow the same track and in the same position as it ends up everywhere else. Human nature is ubiquitous. And this is something we'll be careful of. So, I have to put I know how the Parliament works. This is sort of the issue du jour, has been for a few years. It'll get up. I'm not a fool, but it's wrong. Just because things get through this Parliament doesn't mean it's right. It'll get up, but it's wrong. Shouldn't. And the fruits of the labour of and the intentions is that people will die, and inevitably people will die who don't want to die, and that'll be sanctioned death by the state against the wishes of the person. And the next debate will be about what extensions are to happen to the euthanasia debate, how it can be broadened, and when there are so many other things shouldn't this Parliament really be paramount in wanting to maintain life, not destroy life? It's not premised. I have a faith. It's not premised on faith. Everyone says that, but it's not. It's just premised on logic. When you close your eyes and think, "Do I want to die?" and the answer generally is no.
The rules about
No, and it's actually and you don't interrupt. So it is inevitably it's about euthanasia is the paramount issue within this, but this. So you've got to make a statement. It is certainly a consequence of this, and as it is a consequence of this, it needs to be brought into the light of what the certain outcomes, and I'll be putting on the record what I truly believe is one of the paramount outcomes. The euthanasia bill will go through the territory parliament, and the territory is, even if they wanted to be honest on another issue, but far lesser than this, they did have a vote as to whether they wanted to be a state, and they voted against it. So they're a territory. So if you want to be a state, make yourself a state. And if you're going to be a territory, acknowledge that territories, by their very nature, have the oversight of the Commonwealth. And so it's, if you want to be, and so in closing, I do not support this because it ultimately is a convenient form of palliative care which has the capacity to go into a very evil corner. It will inevitably drift from the certain to the grey, because that always happens. Its clear path, as clearly prescribed in other countries, is that where this starts, it's not where it finishes, and I've identified clear cases of where this has gone into a very sullied and evil place, where people, against their wishes, are being killed. It's not being made up; it's there, the premise of one of the main reasons I'm in this parliament is to do with my very best to preserve life and to make people's lives better, not be a party to anything that kills people.
In accordance with the resolution agreed to on the 1st of August this year, the bill is returned to the House for further consideration. The Clerk.
Government business. Order of the day number 1, grievance debate.
The question is that the grievances be noted, and I give the call to the member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. This morning I had the great honour of meeting 3 extraordinary young people, Thanush, Ismail and Bethlehem. They came and sat in my office, shaking my hand and thanking me for my time, the same way that every other meeting since I came to Parliament has begun. But this meeting was different. Even just sitting in their presence was profound. For a long time, the Government of Australia kept Thanush, Ismail and Bethlehem hidden secret. They were flown out of the country, housed in makeshift camps and referred to by numbers, detained first on Manus Island and Nauru and then in hotel rooms, forced out of sight by the Australian public, hoping that they would be out of our minds. But here they were, Thanush, Ismail and Bethlehem, sitting in my office. They came to give the ongoing impacts of Australia's offshore detention regime a human face, their human face, and to do everything in their power to bring the refugees who remain trapped on Nauru and Papua New Guinea, who they call their brothers and sisters, here to safety. They came to see me because they know that the people of Kooyong stand with them and have sent me to represent Kooyong's call for humane treatment of refugees and people seeking asylum. I heard that call from the people of Kooyong almost every day as I sought their support to become their member during the recent election. Many of the volunteers who generously gave their time to the campaign are about as passionate as you can get about the rights of refugees and asylum seekers. I was inspired in particular by the indefatigable Grandmothers for Refugees who for many years have gathered outside the former member for Kooyong's office, pleading with him to hear their passionate advocacy. I hear them. I'm in Parliament for them. This morning, Bethlehem, who came to Australia from Ethiopia, urged me to call on the government to immediately evacuate all people on Nauru and PNG. She said, "It has been 10 years. People need life and rest and peace." Thanush, who fled Sri Lanka, told me, 10 years ago this brutal policy was introduced and still we are in limbo. I cannot find a house because most people want a permanent visa. and most workplaces reject our applications because I have a temporary visa. I can't see my family because this visa won't let me. Ismail, who fled Somalia nearly 10 years ago, has been free for just 4 months after 7 years on Manus Island and 2 years in the Mantra and Park hotels. He said that his brothers on PNG can't wait any longer, and that's why he can't rest until they're also free. Together they asked me, as the member for Kooyong, to call on the government to immediately enact 3 simple things. To immediately evacuate all remaining refugees currently held offshore in Nauru and Papua New Guinea and allow them to live in the community while Australia sorts out the third country they're supposedly being resettled in. To allow the people who are here, waiting in limbo for their asylum claims to be heard, the right to work, to earn an income, to pay taxes, to contribute to the communities that they're part of, and to give permanent protection for the 31,000 people who have been in this country for close to a decade and make up what has been referred to as the legacy caseload of the failed and shameful fast-track of the previous government. Close to 20,000 of these people are on the arbitrarily punitive temporary protection visas and safe haven enterprise visas, which hold people in a cycle of constant uncertainty, unable to begin to rebuild their lives as members of our communities, and, most cruelly, kept separated from their families with no prospect of reuniting in sight. For a decade, Australia's refugee policy has been one of punishment, punishing people who asked for our protection by detaining them indefinitely. Australia's refugee policy has been one of deterrence, a concept appropriated from criminal sentencing, reducing human beings to cautionary tales, to living examples of the suffering that Australia would exact on anyone else who might come to us for help. For too long, Australia's policy has been cruelty, abject brutalisation and cruelty. This must end. The 47th Parliament of Australia has an opportunity to end this shameful chapter of our nation's history. We have an opportunity to transform Australia's response to the global refugee crisis by increasing our humanitarian intake by 50%, speeding up the processing of asylum seekers' claims so that they aren't left in limbo for years, and providing safe corridors for people fleeing conflict and persecution. We have an opportunity to prepare for what could be a new global humanitarian crisis, people being displaced from their homelands by the impacts of climate change. We have an opportunity to put an end to offshore processing and indefinite detention, and to give a new beginning to the 30,000 people stuck on precarious temporary visas, welcoming them with permanent protection. We have an opportunity to meet the people who come to our shores seeking safety with dignity, compassion and fairness. I'm proud to be one of a record numbers of members of Parliament who are here not as a member of a major party that has been responsible for Australia's policies of cruelty and humiliation, but as an independent sent directly by their electorate to try and dismantle these policies and give refugees the chance to rebuild their lives here with us in Australian communities. And while I am here representing the people of Kooyong, I'll do everything I can to help give protection, freedom, safety and humanity for refugees and for people seeking asylum.
And I give the call to the member for Canberra.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I am proud to acknowledge, as this Parliament does every morning, that I am speaking on the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and thank them for the incredible contribution they make to our city and our region and have done for tens of thousands of years. I'd also like to acknowledge the next generations of First Nations Australians who will carry forward the incredible diversity of culture and language of the oldest continuous civilisation long into the future. And I do sincerely hope that our future and the future of First Nations peoples is one defined by a successful reconciliation, a fully closed gap and a fully implemented Uluru Statement from the heart, including a constitutionally enshrined voice to this Parliament the successful signing of treaties and the undertaking of the important truth-telling process. I'm proud to be a member of a government that is committed to this future and committed to righting the wrongs of the past. I'm proud to be a member of a government that in this term of Parliament will put to the Australian people a referendum to change the Constitution, to recognise First Nations Australians in the nation's birth certificate and to establish the voice to Parliament. And we're doing this, we're pursuing this important reform because the Uluru Statement from the Heart was a gift from First Nations people to the people of Australia. It was a clear, consensus-driven statement that does not ask for much from a community that could have asked for so much more. And as the Prime Minister said at the Garma Festival on the weekend, the Uluru Statement is a hand outstretched, a moving show of faith in Australian decency and Australian fairness from people who have been given every reason to forsake their hope in both. I'm proud that the government is getting on with implementing the Uluru Statement from the Heart, as we have been committed to since it was given in 2017. The Prime Minister also outlined at Garma what the likely question put to the Australian people will be, namely and simply, do you support an alteration to the Constitution that establishes an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice? I believe that Australians will wholeheartedly embrace this proposal because, in the words of the Prime Minister, I believe there is room in Australian hearts for the statement from the heart. Uluru is vitally important to reconciliation and to give First Nations Australians a voice on matters that affect them. But this is not an either-or. It's not about addressing, closing the gap, or the voice to Parliament. We need to do both, and they are important in supporting each other. This is not the only thing that the Albanese government is doing to improve outcomes for First Nations peoples. The Albanese government is completely committed to the doubling of the Indigenous Rangers program and boosting funding to the Indigenous protected areas by $10 million a year. We will deliver the promised cultural water in the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. We're doing this because we know that First Nations land and water management leads to better environmental, social and economic outcomes. The Labor government will invest in justice reinvestment to turn the tide on incarceration and deaths in custody. Deputy Speaker, Australia has seen the tragic deaths of over 500 First Nations Australians while in custody since the Royal Commission almost 30 years ago, and we are committed to ending this crisis. We're going to scrap the punitive and failing community development program and are in the process of getting rid of the cashless debit card right now in this House. Deputy Speaker, the process of reconciliation is a long one, but Labor is completely committed to ensuring it is done and done right. Whether it be the full implementation of the Uluru Statement or the numerous policies we committed to before the election, it's incumbent upon us to do the work, and that's exactly what we will do. I'd also like to speak in this grievance debate about the State of the Environment report that was recently made public by the new Minister for the Environment, Tanya Plibersek. The report showed that the general outlook for the environment in Australia is poor and deteriorating. It is an environment suffering from increasing pressure from climate change, habitat loss, invasive species, pollution and resource extraction. An environment that, as the report says, is the key to our survival and well-being, and its decline will affect us all. As the report notes, the natural world is not separate from the human world. It is the source of our food, water, air and raw materials. Our culture and well-being are interwoven with the places where we live and walk. Ongoing environmental decline also has negative impacts on industries, businesses, regions and individuals. It has been devastating to read these report findings that were hidden from us by the previous government. Findings that include that we have lost more mammal species to extinction than any other continent, that Australia now has more foreign plant species than native species, that the Murray-Darling experienced its lowest water level on record in 2019, that the Black Summer bushfires burned out more than 8 million hectares of native vegetation, and that in the past 5 years alone, an extra 202 plant and animal species and 14 ecological communities were added to the threatened list. The report was buried by the Morrison government. It was handed to the then Environment Minister Susan Ley in December, but it took the new Minister for the Environment and Water, Tanya Plibersek, to release it following the election. It was the same with the second Water for the Environment Special Account report that was handed to the Morrison government in December and buried. Minister Plibersek released it today, and it shows the 450 gigalitre target cannot be achieved under the current program settings, and that the Morrison government had no intention to deliver on the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. We know that Australians want better for our unique environment. I know this because my constituents contact me about climate action and environmental protection more than any other issue. The election made it clear that Australians are sick of excuses and they want action to protect our environment. This morning I had the privilege of visiting the Red Hill Nature Reserve to meet with Landcare volunteers, the Red Hill Regenerators, and I am always struck by the work of these Landcare volunteers that many would not be aware of in our community, just how hard they work to look after our natural areas, which of course in Canberra, our bush capital, are many in amongst our suburbs. This group was formed 30 years ago and have transformed the reserve from one covered in weeds and rubbish to nationally significant woodland, which is home to more than 50 regionally rare or threatened species and 12 nationally threatened species. There are amazing groups like this all over the country, and that shows what can be achieved. Imagine what could be done with national leadership, and I'm proud that Labor will provide that national leadership on the environment. That's why we have introduced as a priority legislation for a more ambitious 2030 emissions target as one of our top priorities in this first sittings. That's why we are establishing an Environmental Protection Agency and making it easier for First Nations Australians to protect their cultural heritage. That's why we will set a national goal of protecting 30% of our land and 30% of our oceans by 2030, joining the global push to safeguard biodiversity. And that's why, importantly, we will respond by the end of this year to the Samuels Review into the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which has failed to protect our unique natural environment and conserve our precious diversity as it was originally intended to do. This is a really important part of environmental protection, and in the last Parliament, we campaigned against and voted against the then government's legislation, which in response to the Samuels Review wanted to rush through legislation to actually weaken those laws. It is vitally important that these laws protect our environment in a meaningful way, and this is what people in Canberra, including the Conservation Council, talk to me about on a regular basis. In particular, they're very concerned at the moment about the Lawson grasslands, which are currently under review. But there's no point in these reviews if these laws do not actually protect our environment. And I'm very pleased that Labor is going to seriously reform those laws and respond to that Samuels Review in a proper manner by the end of this year, as is required. Protecting our environment is core business for Labor, and I am very proud that this government will deliver on this for Australians.
And I give the call to the member for McPherson.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. As I was a minister in the previous government, it's been some years since I have participated in a grievance debate. And on contemplating what issue to raise in this place, it struck me that perhaps it's not so much a single concern, but rather the government's approach to solving the issues that needs to be examined. Now, I do want to be very clear. I'm not blaming the incoming government for all the problems that we currently face. But I do believe that their approach is going to make a challenging situation even harder and have real impacts on the lives of Australians. I'm an engineer by profession. I like to figure out how things work. It's in my nature to analyse a situation carefully. I see a problem and I want to work out the best way to fix it. Some used to call that a common sense approach. I think it's just practical. I believe this sort of approach is the foundation of the progress of humans. It's the basis of invention and design implementation. But I'm deeply concerned that this practical problem-solving approach is being substituted by ideology and symbolism, with little regard for whether the outcome is a problem solved or a problem created. Now, let me provide a few examples from this incoming Labor government and their ideological partners, the Greens. First up is the ideological drive to prematurely end the use of coal and now gas before we have other energy sources that are capable of providing reliable baseload power. Now, as an engineer, I've worked in power stations. I understand the imperative of baseload power. I'm also very clearly on the record as saying we should stop debating whether climate change is real and what degree of impact it is having, and we should get on with developing the technology to address it. So I'm very much in favour of transitioning to cleaner energy sources as soon as possible. And I believe we will, through ingenuity and investment in technology, reach that point. But I'm not in favour of jeopardising the power supply we all rely on in order to tick a box that says we've abolished the use of coal by a date that is arbitrary. What is the sense in that? And I can't, for the life of me, understand the Green ideological obsession with moving away from gas. The reality is that, like most of the world, Australia relies on coal and gas to heat our homes, to power our businesses and to keep our hospitals, schools and essential services operating. I spent a lot of time in the last parliament putting in place protections for our critical infrastructure to ensure they are safe from cyber attack and other threats. An unreliable or intermittent power supply presents an enormous challenge for critical infrastructure and systems of national significance. But how often is this consequence discussed? Deputy Speaker, I clearly and definitively support the move to cleaner energy sources for the future of our planet. The Coalition has worked hard and Australia has achieved greater outcomes when it comes to reducing emissions than many other nations over the past decade, including those who claim the symbolism of being climate warriors. Between 2005 and 2019, Australia has reduced our emissions more quickly than Canada, Japan, New Zealand and the United States. Australia has a strong record of meeting our targets, having beaten our 2020 Kyoto target by 459 million tonnes. On this side of the House, we believe we can achieve net zero through technology, not taxes. We are committed to ongoing practical action, not empty symbolism. Symbolism should not be pursued at a pace that puts lives, livelihoods or our national security at risk. It should not be pursued at a pace that means pensioners can't afford to heat their homes in winter or turn on their air conditioning in summer. It should not be pursued at a pace that means our manufacturers decide to relocate offshore. And let's make no mistake, if we drive up energy costs here or create an unreliable supply, our manufacturers will have little to no choice but to take their production to other countries that do not have such a punitive ideological approach to energy supply. This is the last thing that we need, especially after the pandemic revealed the need to bolster our sovereign capability rather than remain reliant on international supply chains. I am deeply concerned that we have lost all the sense of rationality and common sense when it comes to the climate debate. We are being driven by emotive arguments that don't examine practical outcomes. We have terrified young people into a religious activism of sorts. Many of these kids have no concept of how electricity is produced, what baseload power is and why it's necessary. We've substituted logic for emotion, action for symbolism, and the outcome of this will be a range of unintended, ill-considered consequences that will impact our way of life and our future prosperity. We are seeing the same symbolism with little regard for analysis in the way the government is bullishly pursuing enshrining an Indigenous voice in the Constitution. They are actually insisting that they won't tell us how it will operate and what it will mean for the way our nation is governed. They tell us we should not worry about the practical details because it feels like the right thing to do. That is no way to make a serious decision. It's certainly no way to run a country. We're seeing ideology trump common sense in Labor's move to abolish the cashless debit card, which has benefited some of our most vulnerable Australians. We are seeing ideology prioritised over border security in Labor's policy to abolish temporary protection visas, one of the 3 key pillars of Operation Sovereign Borders. And the ridiculous thing is, they abolished them last time they were in government, and more than 800 boats and 50,000 people arrived illegally. We are still paying for and dealing with the consequences of that emotive, ideological decision. So tonight, my grievance is with the emotive, ideological approach that this government is taking to some of the serious issues that we face as a nation. At a time of great challenge, we need clear thinking, practical action, and we need sensible outcomes. This parliament must be dedicated to fixing problems, not creating bigger ones, no matter the good intentions and the motives. As the old saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I'd also point out that ideology alone doesn't put food on the table and it doesn't keep the lights on. And ultimately, while it might feel good, it also doesn't lift people out of poverty or make our community stronger. I do look forward to working constructively to point out the practical consequences of this government's agenda and what it means for the future of our nation.
And I give the call to the member for Gilmore.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, the week of the 3rd to the 10th of July, we celebrated NAIDOC Week. I want to take the opportunity to tell the House about a couple of fantastic events I attended recently to celebrate NAIDOC Week and our local Indigenous community and why they were so important. The Mogo Aboriginal community in my electorate of Gilmore has been through a lot. Mogo was absolutely devastated by the bushfires that ripped through the south coast on New Year's Eve 2019. So much of the small village was destroyed by fire, including the Mogo Aboriginal Land Council office. The site has only recently been cleaned enough to look at rebuilding, and that work is slowly starting. Many local Aboriginal people lost their homes and were forced to relocate for some time while they rebuilt. Many chose to stay and live however they could because they just couldn't face moving away from their community support. Then came COVID-19 and things got worse for a lot of people. So it was really wonderful to come together with the local community to celebrate the Mogo NAIDOC Big Day Out during NAIDOC Week. This was the first time the community had been able to celebrate a big day out since the bushfires. So it's fair to say it was a really special occasion and very much needed. It was truly heartwarming to see the community come together to celebrate culture in the greatest of ways. There was a traditional smoking ceremony and a welcome to country performed by Walbunja elder Auntie Gloria Nye. There was cultural dancing by Maladar Gamara, which was a real hit with the community, live music and community stalls. There were even free native plants for people to take home. There was fun for the whole family, complete with carnival rides, a jumping castle and lots of kids' activities. It was truly beautiful to see local families enjoying their time together, enjoying the local arts and crafts, chatting to local services and just coming back together to enjoy and celebrate cultural heritage, to celebrate community. I would like to sincerely thank the Mogo NAIDOC Committee for organising and hosting the day, as well as all the local government and community services and contributors, far too many to name here. Thank you everyone, and thank you to the community for supporting this most wonderful day. I know, like many others, we certainly thoroughly enjoyed it. I have been really humbled to help the Mogo community rebuild after the bushfires in as many ways as I can, and cultural heritage is such an important part of that. Before the bushfires destroyed much of the Mogo Public Schools grounds, I secured the school a $15,000 grant to build a yarning circle. I was really pleased in the months after the bushfires to see the amazing work being done by volunteers like the Block, crew members and suppliers from local businesses who joined together to rebuild the school's outdoor area with the support of Westpac Bank and selfless donations from the Mogo community. When the yarning circle was finally complete in April 2021, after not only the bushfires but also the floods and then COVID-19, it was another really special moment to celebrate its opening with the school community. Thank you again to everyone who made that possible. I can't wait to celebrate so many more beautiful community days with this wonderful community as we continue working together to rebuild. Deputy Speaker, just this Sunday, I had the absolute honour of attending the Boongaree Reconciliation Garden Tree Planting Day at Bundawalla Creek near Berry. The event was to mark National Tree Day and to start the building of a reconciliation garden on Jerinja tribal country. This is a joint venture with the community, Boongaree Bush Care, the Jerinja Tribe, Berry Land Care sponsors government, the Jerinja Local Aboriginal Land Council and Nowra Aboriginal Land Council. Even the local Berry Public Schools Plant Propagation Unit helped grow many of the trees so that we can preserve our local biodiversity. At the event, there was a traditional Jerinja tribal welcome to country by Auntie Grace Crossley. Thank you, Auntie Grace. And the planting of a ceremonial tree, followed by planting 600 trees and a wonderful community barbecue. The purpose of the Boongaree Reconciliation Garden is to provide an inspiring space for the community to connect with our local Indigenous culture. The garden is just the latest stage in the Boongaree development, which has been transforming this part of Berry, making it a wonderful community space. Shoalhaven City Council has been working with the local community to develop the concept design, and that work is ongoing. I truly cannot wait to see how this garden develops. I just know it is going to be an absolutely spectacular and special place. I'd like to thank Boongaree Bush Care and in particular Site Coordinator Hugh, the Jerinja Local Aboriginal Land Council and Jerinja community, in particular Jerinja Tribal Elder Ron Carberry for his instrumental work on the garden, Nowra Local Aboriginal Land Council, Berry Land Care, Shoalhaven City Council and all of the partners that made this day such a beautiful celebration of culture, reconciliation and understanding. You see, Deputy Speaker, wonderful community events like Boongaree's National Tree Day and Mogo's Big Day Out have so many special purposes. Of course, they are a chance for the local Indigenous community to join together and create that cultural connection, that sense of belonging. I know this was something the community really struggled with during COVID-19, that separation. It gives these communities the chance to celebrate heritage and see their traditions live on, to pass them down to the next generation. Cultural ceremony is such an important thing for our Indigenous communities, but there is another purpose as well. It also gives the broader community a chance to celebrate with our Indigenous brothers and sisters. It gives us a chance to learn about their heritage and traditions. Our understanding can grow, our tolerance and our acceptance can grow too, so we can all truly feel like one community. We can move together in kindness, in unity and in the same spirit, working towards the same goals and building a better future. Deputy Speaker, this is why we need to have an Indigenous voice to our nation's parliament. Not to create difference or a divide, but to create unity, to bring us together in understanding and in love. Our Indigenous communities deserve to have a say, a real say, in policies that impact them. Because there is so much between us that is the same, but there is so much between us that is different, and so much that we still need to learn. Deputy Speaker, we can continue along this same path where we as a government try to tell Indigenous communities what is good for them, what they need. And, as often happens, we will get it wrong. We will do more harm. And we will then have to come along and undo it, scrap the script and try again. We've seen this before. We've been here before, and we know it doesn't work. So it is time for a reset, time to shift gears And instead of telling, we need to listen. Drop the divide and bring us all together, just like we did at Mogo's Big Day Out, just like we did at Boongaree's Tree Planting Day. This past weekend, I was incredibly proud, excited, humbled to see our Prime Minister stand up at the Garma Festival and set out our way forward on the Uluru Statement from the Heart by enshrining a First Nations voice to Parliament. The question is simple: do you support it? But it is so absolutely important. There isn't anything radical here, nothing crazy, just a chance for us to move forward as a country together for a better future. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples deserve to be in our founding document. They deserve that recognition, that symbol. Even now, there is still a lot of hurt in Indigenous communities. No one symbol will undo the wrongs of the past, but it is a good start. But more than the symbol, our Indigenous people deserve a say in the laws that impact them. There has been no mechanism for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to provide advice to the Australian Parliament. And I truly believe now is the time to change that. So let's have the conversation. Let's get the referendum moving. We want to build consensus on this, and that is the next step that an Albanese Labor government will take. Deputy Speaker, I think it's really important, though, to ask one thing of all sides of this conversation. Please, from the bottom of my heart, please, let's conduct this conversation respectfully. Let's keep in mind how much hurt there is. Let's keep in mind how tough the past few years have been for everyone, but that the last 100 years have been tough for our Indigenous communities. And let's all make a genuine effort not to create more harm, more hurt. Let's be kind to each other and kind to our neighbours. Let's take the time to learn, to understand, and to really think about what it means, not just to us, but to others and to our country. We should move forward with this conversation. That spirit, that sense of community and belonging together. We can build a better future together, so let's get on with it.
And I give the call to the member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. When COVID hit in early 2020, it was impossible to know the scale of the damage that it would do to our country. And for the last 2.5 years, Australians have followed health advice to the letter, with our chief medical officers and chief health officers also, who have provided advice to both federal and state governments around the pandemic. We've had our vaccinations. I myself have had, almost lost count now, Deputy Speaker, 3 I think I've had so far, probably due for another one soon. We've worn our masks, we've social distanced, and we stayed at home for months at a time when the virus ran rampant through our cities. And many of us in this place actually isolated for 2 weeks at a time after each sitting of Parliament. And so there are many in this place who are also very much impacted by the lockdowns as well. But as we learn to live with the virus, we need to remember that the pandemic is not over, and we also need to remember that it was under our government that we actually rolled the plan out to learn to live with the virus, to get to the stage where we're at right now, where we are able to move in between states and we're not in a lockdown environment. And it was our government that delivered that national plan for those Australians who might be listening. But especially for those living and working in aged care or with loved ones in aged care, and that's what I want to talk about tonight. At the start of the pandemic, Labor played a fairly bipartisan role, Mr Deputy Speaker, but instead of tearing us down and having a go at us, they worked with us. They did at that time, and they championed the health advice. But that, in true Labor style, quickly turned into political attacks undermining not only the government but the advice from some of the best health experts in the world. Labor even pre-selected a candidate, Mr Deputy Speaker, who repeatedly made anti-AstraZeneca comments throughout the vaccine rollout. And in my own state of Queensland, there was also some anti-AstraZeneca sentiment coming from the now Governor-General, which I think at the time was both inappropriate and had a dangerous impact on those having AstraZeneca. I myself had AstraZeneca being in that age group, and then that changed, and I was thankfully fine with the AstraZeneca vaccine. But that's how much they respected the advice from the top medical experts across our country. And with more than 20 million lives saved worldwide, 20 million lives with COVID-19 vaccines, it was the AstraZeneca vaccine that has saved many more lives than any other. If Labor weren't attacking us on COVID-19 vaccines, then they were attacking us on aged care. And it's interesting how Labor said one thing when they were in opposition about the work we did to protect aged care residents and staff during COVID-19, but now that they're in government, the talking points have changed. So both sides of the mouth in true Labor style. When he was in opposition, the now Prime Minister loved to say how the aged care sector was in crisis. Well, it's pretty clear that since Labor came into government less than 3 months ago, that the crisis has worsened. And when Labor, I'll just go through some numbers with you, Deputy Speaker. When Labor was sworn in May, there were 6,274 active COVID-19 cases in 780 active outbreaks in residential aged care facilities across the nation. By July 29, so May to end of July, that number had increased drastically to 9,906 active COVID-19 cases in 1,064 active outbreaks in residential aged care facilities across the country. There was also an increase in deaths, sadly, and of course every single death across the country that is related to COVID, or that is indeed related to anything across the country, is a terrible travesty. But I'm talking particularly about the deaths in COVID and particularly in aged care homes around the country. So there was an increase in deaths from 2,400 in May to 3,300 at the end of July in aged care alone, Deputy Speaker. These are pretty big numbers under Labor's watch. That's just under 100 deaths a week in aged care under this Albanese government, and almost more than the number of deaths in aged care in 2020 and 2021 combined. So clearly, there's been a massive increase in cases in aged care and a massive increase in deaths in aged care under Labor's watch. I'll just repeat that. Just under 100 deaths a week in aged care under this government, and almost more than the number of deaths in aged care in 2020 and 2021 combined. In my home state of Queensland, there were more than 40 deaths in July alone in aged care. And I note the Aged Care Minister has already been out this week saying that aged care residents are safer this winter than they were in the previous winters, which is completely at odds with the rising figures of cases and deaths in aged care. Now, last year, the now Minister for Health and Aged Care attacked our record on COVID-19 deaths in aged care, saying, and I quote, "Tragically, 685 Australians died in aged care homes from COVID-19 because the Morrison government didn't have a plan." So I say to the Minister, to Minister Butler and his government, that if that is the benchmark, then what is Labor's plan? I mean, do they even have a plan? Or are they just putting a Band-Aid solution on Band-Aid solution and hoping that Australians turn the other eye? With vaccination rates declining in aged care and a worsening workforce shortage, the government's decision to extend ADF support until September is just another temporary solution, Deputy Speaker. They are facing rising cases and rising deaths, and it's clear this government has no idea what they're doing when it comes to COVID-19 or aged care. This also shows that Labor's promise for 24/7 nurses in aged care is just that, an empty promise. There are clearly workforce challenges associated with that we've heard today in the other chamber, there's no quick fix there from Labor to be able to do that. Labor still hasn't explained how it plans to support the workforce or how it will prioritise the needs of senior Australians in care. If they can't sort the workforce out now, how can they possibly attract the thousands of nurses they need to fulfil that promise to Australians? I don't see how they're going to be able to do it. It's easy for them to throw stones from the other side when you've never actually had to guide a nation through a once-in-a-100-year pandemic. They should have been paying attention when we were in government, Mr Deputy Speaker, rather than just running attack lines through the media. I'm incredibly proud to have been a member of the Morrison government during the last parliament. Under the leadership of Scott Morrison, Josh Frydenberg and Greg Hunt, We invested over $45 million in our COVID-19 health response and $314 billion in economic support. Our vaccination rates are among the highest in the world, and our loss of life was one of the lowest in the world. From the outset of the pandemic, aged care was a major focus for the Morrison government, and we undertook significant measures to protect aged care residents, staff and their families. We provided millions of units of PPE from the National Medical Stockpile, millions of rapid antigen tests, ADF support, surge workforce support and additional payments to aged care staff to recognise the extra work that they were undertaking, and I'm sure they remember that. It was also our government who called the Royal Commission into aged care to ensure Australians can access the respect, dignity and care that they deserve. We had a comprehensive response. 5 key pillars were outlined by the Minister: home care, residential aged care services and sustainability, residential aged care quality and safety, workforce and governance, at an investment of $19.1 billion. Mr Deputy Speaker. As a part of that response, a plan to support the aged care workforce, which is more than can be said for Labor. So I ask the government again, what are they doing to reduce the increased number of deaths in aged care and protect our most vulnerable during COVID-19? And while every loss of life, as I said, is a deep tragedy, this government needs to be upfront with aged care residents, with staff, with their families about what their plan is moving forward. Because 800 deaths since May is simply not good enough in the aged care sector. The government needs to do more to protect our vulnerable Australians during this current Omicron wave, and clearly they haven't been doing enough when it comes to those 5 key pillars set out by Minister Hunt when he was the Minister for Health and Aged Care, in terms of moving forward with the sector to protect those most vulnerable Australians who are in aged care. I call on this government to do more for quality, to do more for safety, to do more for the current Omicron wave that is going through aged care, and to do more to reduce the death rate.
And I give the call to the member for Moreton.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and good to see you in the chair. Because, Deputy Speaker, I want to share this really great story about koalas in my electorate. My electorate takes in Toohey Forest, an ecological island in suburbia, just 10 kilometres from the Brisbane CBD, surrounded by residences and industrial estates. The 260-hectare Toohey Forest is home to koalas, short-beaked echidnas, lace monitors, bearded dragons, squirrel gliders, wallabies, an array of birdlife and over 400 species of native wildlife and plant species. Many locals use the many walking trails and riding trails and enjoy seeing koalas and other fauna in their natural habitat. The forest merges into Griffith University's Nathan and Mount Gravatt campuses. A few years ago, one of the koalas got into the habit of repeatedly crossing Ring Road, which runs around the Nathan campus. For some reason, this very determined koala decided to cross the road at about the same time in the same place every afternoon. To prevent anything happening to their beloved koala, a campus security guard was assigned to guide the koala across the road each afternoon. For several days, the guard stood next to the tree around the time the koala took its journey. When the animal came down to ground level, the guard watched and stopped traffic so that it didn't get hurt. Now, that is Griffith University's service. No wonder that university actually has the numbers in the Labor executive government at the moment. Quite amazing. But where the koalas in Toohey Forest come from is a bit of a mystery, but according to Griffith University researchers, they started reappearing about a decade or so ago. The koalas appear to be thriving, and their numbers in the 260-hectare forest have become clear only recently, mainly thanks to the work of a great local, Brad Lambert, who is also a senior teacher with Toohey Forest Environmental Education Centre. Brad has recorded all the wildlife that he has found in Toohey Forest on the Atlas of Living Australia website. He's also started a Toohey Forest Wildlife Facebook page to engage with the community with the vision statement, inspiring conservation by connecting communities to nature. This fauna-rich habitat is intersected by a very busy Toohey Road. Koalas and other small animals are at risk from the speeding traffic. I'm pleased that an Albanese Labor government is investing in a fauna crossing under Toohey Road that will let our koalas and other small animals move between the eastern and western sides of their urban habitat. This crossing will hopefully protect our local koalas in the same way that the Griffith Security Guard protected that road crossing koala, but without paying the overtime. Koalas are an endangered species, sadly. Australians need to take their protection seriously. The fauna crossing will ensure that the koala colony living in our precious urban forests will be protected. And also want to commend the Palaszczuk government for their announcement today on securing more land to protect the koalas in the Coomera Connector Corridor. Deputy Speaker, my office is located in Sunnybank. This is a suburb that people travel from all over Brisbane to enjoy the rich cultural food and shopping experience of this vibrant and bustling precinct. The thriving Sunnybank Plaza and Sunny Park shopping centres are separated by Mains Road, and the bus stops on either side of Mains Road are used by commuters and students travelling into the city. More than 5,000 people use this pedestrian bridge spanning Mains Road every day, and this bridge has needed an upgrade for quite a few years. I've brought this important issue to the attention of Brisbane City Council Lord Mayor Schrinner repeatedly, but my letters since 2019 asking for an upgrade to the pedestrian bridge have been ignored. So I'm pleased to announce that the Albanese Labor government will step up and provide $2 million to get this pedestrian crossing sorted. The upgrade will include elevators on both sides to improve accessibility for seniors, people with disability, those with small children, new security cameras that will provide improved safety for the more than 5,000 pedestrians crossing over Mains Road each day. The Dragon Bridge upgrade will celebrate the rich cultural melting pot that is Sunnybank. The Dragon is a significant symbol for my Asian communities. Many people were attracted to this part of the south side of the Brisbane River because, if you look at it from the air, it appears to be the heart of an enormous dragon that curls from the bay in and then snakes around Brisbane's CBD. One feng shui interpretation is that Sunnybank is a place of good fortune and good luck, the dragon's heart. So, after 2 years of a pandemic and counting, the local businesses connected by the Dragon Bridge could do with a bit of luck. The bridge will hopefully be a very distinctive landmark right in the heart of Brisbane's vibrant Asian diaspora communities. The upgraded bridge will provide easier passage between the shops and restaurants and schools, aged care facilities, etc. on either side of a very busy Mains Road. The upgrade will be delivered in consultation with local governments, state governments, the local business groups and the local community. Deputy Speaker, I'm also very excited that an Albanese Labor government will supercharge the benefits of household solar by delivering a community battery for Maruka. Around 1,400 households in the Maruka area have rooftop solar, but the high price of household batteries means that families are still struggling to realise the full potential of rooftop panels, and it's putting more pressure on our electricity grid. Local households who might be unable to install solar, like renters and the people living in apartments, will also be able to draw from excess energy stored in this community battery. This is a local and practical example of how, with a good Labor government, we can reduce emissions and boost renewable energy and make sure people's electricity bills are lower. Deputy Speaker, Labor's commitment to invest in funds to remove the Coopers Plains level crossing will mean that we are moving closer to finally removing one of Brisbane's worst rail crossings. This level crossing has been identified by RACQ as one of Queensland's worst and most dangerous. The Coopers Plains level crossing traverses 3 separate rail tracks on the Beenleigh and Gold Coast lines. The boom gates are lowered 138 times each day, causing frustration for motorists and pedestrians who have to wait for the trains to pass. With as many as 1,000 cars and trucks passing the level crossing each hour, there have been numerous accidents, including over 28 cases of cars hitting the boom gates over the past 7 years. That's too many close calls. We know that the number of passenger and freight trains using these lines will increase in coming years, particularly as Cross River Rail kicks off. This project will be delivered in partnership with the Palaszczuk State Government, and I thank Mark Bailey for his contribution, and Peter Russo, my state colleagues, and the Brisbane City Council. Good work, some great advocacy from Maruka Ward Labor councillor Steve Griffiths, but there's more work to be done. Residents of Coopers Plains have already been consulted on the 2 options that the Department of Transport and Main Roads released earlier this year. The Palaszczuk Labor government and the Albanese Labor governments have both committed a third each, around $133 million, to fix the crossing. However, the Brisbane City Council has only committed 1/10 of the cost. The Brisbane City Council is only going to stump up $40 million. So I'm calling on the LNP Brisbane City Council to pay their fair share. The LNP Brisbane City Council has committed 50% in the past to build 2 level crossings on the north side of the river. So all I'm asking is for the council to commit 1/3 of the project cost, not half, just 1/3, and for the Coopers Plains level crossing will then be fully funded. Infrastructure investments like this deliver a better life for locals across Brisbane, and Moreton locals need the infrastructure that our community deserves, like they get on the north side of the river. By removing this dangerous crossing, an Albanese Labor government will not only allow locals to spend more time at home and less time on the roads, the congested roads, but it will deliver safer roads to the local drivers, to the pedestrians, to the kids going to Coopers Plains State School, and to obviously make life easier for the train drivers on this busy corridor. They will help unblock congestion and deliver more jobs and a better future for local families. It was actually the former federal Labor government, the Rudd-Gillard governments, that fully funded the $280 million upgrade of the intersection between Mains Road and Kessels Road, also a notorious choke point. That project was completed in mid-2014, but that project was kicked off by myself and the Rudd-Gillard governments. This project has greatly improved safety and reduced congestion along the corridor that connects the busy Ipswich, Pacific and Gateway motorways. Federal Labor has a strong record of delivering for Brisbane Southside. I'm very pleased to be a part of the federal Labor government that will deliver some much-needed infrastructure in my electorate.
I thank the member for Moreton. And there being no further grievances, the debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate will be made in order of the day for the next sitting. And I give the call to the member for Pearce, I understand.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I move that the Federation Chamber do now adjourn.
Second the motion.
So the question is that the motion be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. Against no. I think the ayes have it. And that means that the Federation Chamber now stands adjourned until 9:30 a.m. Tomorrow, Wednesday, the 3rd of August 2022. Thank you.